Imagine opening your eyes inside a towering medieval castle, not to soft pillows and silken sheets, but to the kind of bedding that would make a chiropractor weep. There were no memory foam mattresses or plush duvets here. If you were lucky, you'd have a bag of old straw stuffed into a linen sack, likely the same straw from last year's harvest. And yes, people got injured by their mattresses. You heard that right. Real medieval medical texts include treatments for straw-related bruises and punctures. Now picture being a black noblewoman in this towering fortress. Even with status, you'd just have a wooden bed frame under that same unforgiving sack of straw. That's how royalty lived large, and there was no gentle wake-up chime from your phone, no soothing sunlight pouring in through glass pane windows. Instead, your day might start with a rooster having a full-blown identity crisis at dawn, or worse, a man stomping through stone corridors shouting a medieval version of "Wakey, wakey." Yes, that was someone's full-time job. Forget warm, cozy interiors. Castle walls were made of thick stone, not to trap heat but to repel armies. Great in a siege, terrible for sleeping. They didn't have fireplaces in every bedroom. Most folks just wore the same clothes to bed they had on the whole day before, not because they were lazy, but because it was the only way not to freeze overnight. And windows? Forget it. These weren't windows like we know them. They were narrow slits meant for launching arrows, not letting in sunshine. So if it was cloudy outside, and in medieval Europe it usually was, you woke up in pitch black. Many people would trip over a chamber pot or stub their toe on a stone wall before even standing up straight. And if you happened to be on the servant side of castle life, you were up long before the sun, maybe before your body even wanted to move. You woke on that same straw, no bed frame, no privacy, huddled in a corner of the servants' quarters or kitchen floor. The castle's morning chill didn't discriminate, but your position sure did. Getting out of that painful bed was just the beginning. The next challenge? Cleaning yourself, if you could even call it that. The first thing you'd face was a bucket of freezing cold water. No hot showers, no fancy basins, just one brutal slap of icy reality straight from a castle well. If you were a maid like Zahara, working from dusk till dawn, you'd have to splash that glacier water on your face before starting chores, while your teeth chattered like castanets. Some castles tried to be clever. A few even ran pipes near the kitchen fires to warm water. But those pipes, made of lead, so people had to choose: stay dirty or slowly poison yourself. Either way, not exactly a relaxing start to the day. And soap? Oh, the soap was something else. Made from a mix of wood ash and animal fat, it smelled like burnt bacon and disappointment. Scrubbing yourself with it felt more like sanding down your skin than getting clean. If you lived in a richer household, say, working under Lady Mavis, the noble black matriarch of the East Wing, you might come across Castile soap made with olive oil. But that was so expensive. It cost as much as a sheep. Nobody was wasting that on the kitchen staff. Now, when nature called, you had two options: a chamber pot or the guard robe. Neither was pleasant. A guard robe was essentially a hole in the wall, part bathroom, part closet, where people believed the stench would keep moths away from clothes. The smell was so strong, some folks swore it kept evil spirits out too. And if you were unlucky enough not to have a guard robe nearby, you used a chamber pot and tossed the contents out the window. But etiquette demanded a warning shout, something like "Gardez-vous," to warn unsuspecting souls below. That's where the phrase, "look out below," really earned its reputation. If you lived or worked in a castle housing 150 people and just 5 working latrines, privacy didn't exist. You lined up. You waited. You prayed. Even queens weren't spared. In fact, having an audience during your morning toilet was seen as a privilege. Nobles like Lady Mavis had servants attend them while they did their business, as if managing a human body was a public honor. Those servants, like young Nia, assigned to Lady Mavis's personal staff, had the prestigious yet revolting job of washing, dressing, and emptying that chamber pot every morning. It was called Groom of the Stool, and believe it or not, it was one of the most sought-after roles in the castle, simply because it gave you access to the highest ranks of power. So whether you were scrubbing with fat and ashes, dodging, flying waste, or managing someone else's, hygiene in a medieval castle was a full-body assault. And this was all before breakfast. If you thought surviving the cold and dodging chamber pots was tough, wait until you tried to get breakfast. In a medieval castle, what you ate in the morning depended entirely on who you were and who you weren't. If you were a noble like Lord Ezra, you'd sit high at the great table, your plate stacked with roasted meats, imported figs, and bread still warm from the oven. You might sip a golden goblet of small beer while the cooks bowed and scraped, trying to guess what seasoning would suit your mood today. But if you were a servant, say like Jamil, who'd been up for 5 hours hauling water and sweeping rushes, you were lucky to get a spoonful of pottage. That's what they called it anyway. Pottage was a sad, boiling mess of vegetables that were one day away from rotting. It tasted like boiled disappointment and looked like it had lost a fight with a ladled bread. The staple of the medieval diet wasn't always a blessing. Nobles used thick, rock-hard slices of stale bread as plates, called trenchers. After they soaked up meat juices and sauces for a few days, they were passed down to the poor. If you were on the receiving end, you'd need teeth stronger than, a knight's shield to chew through it. And let's not forget drinks. The castle wells? Contaminated. After centuries of tossing waste out windows, the water ran brown and suspicious. So instead, everyone drank beer, even the kids. Not the heavy ale, something called small beer, with low alcohol but just enough to kill the germs. In one mid-sized castle, records show that people drank up to 8 gallons a week per person. That's 3,000 pints of beer flowing through a castle like it was a brewery with beds. Forks? Not a thing yet. Only the extremely fashionable Italians used them, and even then, people thought it was a little snobbish. Everyone else used fingers, which meant that greasy hands were everywhere. One noble dining guide from the time specifically warned, "Do not wipe your oily hands on your beard." The fact that this had to be written down says enough. Where you sat during breakfast was as political as any war strategy. The closer you were to the lord or lady, the more powerful you were. And that wasn't just about proximity, it was about salt, literally. The salt cellar sat at the head of the table, and the phrase, "below the salt," meant you were a nobody. People would sword fight over the right to sit near the salt. Yes, actual sword fights. Over seasoning. Timing wasn't equal either. Nobles ate around 10 or 11 in the morning, after prayers and castle business. But the kitchen staff? They snatched bites when no one was looking. Records show one cook got caught with 3 stolen meat pies stuffed in his tunic. He claimed it was for warmth, and storing food was a game of faith. No refrigerators meant meats were preserved with salt, smoke, and sheer optimism. When food started turning green, the solution wasn't to toss it out. It was to test it on the peasants. A real recipe note read, "If meat smells strange, feed it to the servants." First, that was medieval food safety. If you lived through breakfast, you were considered lucky and strong. Forget the fairy tale images of sparkling stone floors and polished halls. Inside a real medieval castle, the ground beneath your feet was a living, breathing biohazard. And that's if you were lucky. The floor was rarely just stone. It was covered in something called rushes, dried grass mixed with herbs like lavender and meadowsweet. Sound charming? It was meant to absorb messes and mask the smell. But here's the horror. Those rushes were only fully replaced once a year. Every few weeks, new layers were sprinkled on top. That meant beneath the surface, you were walking on months of spilled stew, wine, chicken bones, rat droppings, human filth, and worse. If you were a maid like sweet young Amara, it was your job to sweep around the castle, knowing deep down that sweeping the rushes was like putting perfume on a corpse. Animals roamed the castle freely. Chickens strutted across banquet tables, dogs chased cats under benches, and livestock occasionally wandered into the hallways. There's even a story of a prized falcon relieving itself in the middle of a noble's dinner plate. The guests barely blinked. That was normal. And the smell? A perfume factory couldn't compete with this medley. You had smoke from fire pits that clung to your clothes, unwashed bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, food left out too long, and the unmistakable bouquet of waste drifting up from the castle's lovely toilets, those infamous guardrobes. Those toilets were nothing more than stone holes that emptied straight down the castle walls. In the summer, the stench would rise like a cursed mist. One chronicler described it as a natural defense, so bad some enemies abandoned their siege to escape the smell. Medieval biological warfare, unintentionally effective. Walls weren't innocent either. In a damp climate, thick stone walls would sweat, creating the perfect breeding ground for mold. Tapestries hung from nearly every surface, not for beauty, but to absorb moisture. Over time, they turned into mini ecosystems, nests for bugs, hideouts for mice, and a paradise for mildew. And the kitchen? It was its own olfactory battlefield. There were no sinks, no waste bins, just food scraps tossed out the nearest window. Spoiled meat was often spiced so heavily it fooled the tongue, if not the stomach. One chef reportedly saved bad cuts of beef by boiling them in a stew so spicy it made the diner cry before the meat touched the spoon. Behind the castle was often a growing hill made of bones, trash, broken dishes, and general filth. What one poet sarcastically called the Isaitimer castle's memory. Still, through the smells and the muck, life continued. People walked those halls barefoot. They ate, they sang, they prayed. For castle folk like Malik the stable hand or Lady Mavis of the East Wing, this mess was simply home, and no one dared complain too loudly, unless they wanted to spend a day cleaning the rushes, or worse, under them. Despite the chaos inside, a medieval castle wasn't built for comfort. It was built for war. Think of it as part mansion, part military bunker, and part giant try-me challenge to anyone dumb enough to attack. The walls? Not just thick, ridiculously thick. Some were up to 20 feet wide at the base. Imagine trying to dig through that with a shovel made of wood and desperation. Knights trained daily within those cold walls. Picture Sir Obasi, a broad-shouldered black warrior with armor that weighed more than 2 toddlers, aiming arrows through narrow slits in the stone. These slits, called arrow loops, were so tiny you had to shoot at the perfect angle or hit the wall. Still, Obasi could strike a target the size of a dinner plate from 200 yards. Meanwhile, he couldn't hit the chamber pot in the middle of the night. Go figure. Then there were the infamous murder holes. These charming features were carved into ceilings over castle gates. If attackers got too close, guards would dump rocks, hot oil, or anything awful they could grab, sometimes even angry bees. One castle inventory listed 3 barrels of oil, 2 bags of lime, and 1 beehive, very irritated, as official defense supplies. And if all else failed, there was always the moat. Not just for show, moats were often filled with sewage, dead animals, or muddy water so thick you could lose a shoe and never see it again. Some castles had advanced drainage systems to flood the moat in under an hour. One French castle boasted a moat that appeared dry until the switch was pulled. An entire troop of invaders once got stuck waist-deep, screaming, "It was dry 5 minutes ago!" The drawbridge operator had one job: don't mess up. But mistakes happened. In one Welsh castle, the drawbridge was lifted too early, stranding half the soldiers outside and worse, slicing a cow in half. The cow survived. The operator's pride? Not so much. But the real genius lay in the spiral staircases. Always designed to wind clockwise as you ascended, they gave defenders, who were usually right-handed, the advantage. Invaders, with less room to swing their swords, would stumble like toddlers on roller skates. And those steps, uneven on purpose. If you didn't know the trick, you'd trip before reaching the second floor. Even the kids had roles. Young Io and Zuri, children of a castle baker, were often seen carrying messages during siege drills or chucking spoiled vegetables off the battlements during mock battles. Once, they turned it into a game, throwing turnips at each other from opposing towers. The staff was not amused, especially when one hit the jester mid-song. Siege prep was taken seriously. Every castle stocked food, weapons, and supplies like they were planning for the apocalypse. One inventory listed 500 arrows, 200 salted fish, and, oddly, 3 juggling balls. Because even in a siege, someone needed to keep morale up, defending. The castle wasn't just about brute force, it was about outlasting the enemy. If you could make it stink, confuse, trap, or starve them long enough, you'd win. And from Surabasi to Little Io, everyone in the castle played a role in turning home into fortress. Medieval castle life wasn't all chamber pots and drawbridges. When the shouting stopped and the fires burned low, people let loose in ways that would confuse and sometimes terrify us today. Let's start with jousting. You'd think galloping full speed at someone with a wooden pole was risky enough. But knights, especially show-offs like Sir Malik the Thunder, always craved a bigger thrill. Historical records show knights jousting blindfolded, riding backward, or on mules just to entertain a crowd. Sir Malik once challenged another knight to a one-lance, one-chicken duel. Nobody remembers who won, just that the chicken survived. Then there were the dice games. Gambling was technically banned, which made it even more popular. Names like Hazard, Cross and Pile, and the most dramatic of all, God's Dice, circulated like wildfire through the castle halls. At one castle, a servant named Jorah won his master's favorite horse, only to lose it, along with 3 months' pay, on the next roll. But the real stars of medieval entertainment? The jesters. Don't picture a clown in bells just juggling. Fruit. A jester was a walking tightrope, half comedian, half court therapist, and full-time risk-taker. They were the only ones who could insult the king and live to talk about it. The most famous was a black jester named Kwaku, known across 3 kingdoms for making the Duke of Darlington weep with laughter, and once with rage. Kwaku had a way of turning castle gossip into rhyming songs. When a knight fell off his horse, drunk, Kwaku sang about Sir Tumblesaddle for a month. Even the queen snorted wine out her nose at that one. Some jesters were paid more than senior guards, because, let's be honest, laughter might not stop an arrow, but it sure made surviving castle life a little easier. Music was everywhere, during meals, prayers, chores, and even baths. Castle musicians weren't treated like royalty. They worked non-stop. A typical day, play during breakfast, then again during weapons cleaning. Then another tune while Lady Mavis braided her hair. By dinner, the lute player's fingers were trembling like leaves in a storm. And the instruments? One was called the bladder pipe. Yes, it was exactly what it sounds like, an instrument made from an animal's bladder. Nothing sets the mood like wind music from a goat organ. Feasts were another spectacle, not just meals, events. A centerpiece, called a subtlety, would sit in the middle of the hall. It might be a pastry castle stuffed with live birds that burst out when cut open, or a life-sized knight made of marzipan riding a horse sculpted from roasted chickens. One cook even crafted a dragon made entirely of fish bones and cherries. The smell? Questionable. The applause? Thunderous. Of course, someone had to clean up the aftermath. After a night of heavy drinking, music, and half-jousting through the hallway, poor Jamil the stable hand once spent 4 hours picking chicken feathers out of the rushes. And yes, the falcon pooped on the dessert again, but in a world of constant war, cold, and disease, medieval people knew the value of joy. Whether it came from a ridiculous bet, a clever joke, or a musical goat bladder, entertainment wasn't optional. It was survival with a smile. You think your job is tough? Try working in a medieval castle. Forget coffee machines and ergonomic chairs. In here, your day started before the sun and ended only when your body gave up. A castle could employ anywhere from 50 to 200 people, and every single one had a title that sounded like a medieval joke, until you realized how brutally real it was. Take the gong farmer, for example. That was the person who cleaned out the toilets. Yes, the same ones that dropped straight down castle walls. They worked at night to spare others from the smell, and were paid well because no one else wanted the job. People even gossiped that being a gong farmer guaranteed you'd never lose your sense of smell, because you'd already lost it. In the kitchens, life was a boiling, smoking, sweating mess. Cooks like Mama Della, a proud black woman who ran the kitchen, like a general, worked in shifts around the clock. The castle produced over 6,000 calories of food per person per day, mostly because preservation was poor and eating was constant. No refrigerators meant everything had to be cooked now or thrown into the "let's hope this is still edible" stew. There were even specialized jobs like the saucier, who made sauces all day long. One boy named Toby had the glamorous role of turnbroach, his only task, turning the spit over the fire. When he fell asleep one evening, the roast turned to charcoal and the night it was meant for turned to fury. Toby still claimed he was perfecting the art of crunch. Guards had the dullest job, until it got dangerous. They stood around 99% of the time trying to look fierce, and the other 1% running for their lives. Some castles made guards sing during shifts, just to prove they were awake. One log from 1387 states, "No intrusions tonight, but please tell Ralph to stop singing. It may be scaring us." The blacksmith was a hero in his own right. He repaired swords, pots, gates, even broken doorknobs shaped like dragons because the Lord really liked dragons. Master Omari, the castle's blacksmith, once wrote in his log, "Lady Mavis wants dragon-shaped handles again. Must remind her dragons are not real." Again. Knights were the celebrities of the castle, but their lives weren't just jousts and glory. They trained daily, kept armor polished, mentored squires, and attended a lot of ceremonies. One night Sir Thelonious grumbled after a 6-hour rain-soaked parade. "Spent all morning shining my armor, spent all afternoon rusting in it." And those squires? They were knight trainees who did everything from mucking out stables to helping Sir Thelonious put on his armor, a job that took 30 minutes, 3 hands, and a bucket of patience. Most of the time the squire got more bruises than the knight ever did. But no one ran the place like the lady of the castle. Lady Mavis wasn't just a noblewoman in pearls. She was the CEO, the head of HR, the finance director, and the mother to everyone inside the stone walls. While her husband, Lord Ezra, went off to swing swords on crusades, she stayed behind and made sure the place didn't collapse into chaos. She managed budgets that would make a Wall Street banker sweat. Her records listed every chicken laid, every barrel of beer brewed, every arrow accidentally shot into the roof by drunk guards. She even scribbled notes in the margins like "stop paying archers when drunk." Terrible aim. Food management was a nightmare. She had to plan months ahead, storing enough grain, meat, and dried peas to survive a siege. At one point she ordered 2,000 salted fish and wrote beside the entry, "If it smells worse than the moat, send it back." She settled every squabble, like the one between the cook and the baker. The cook complained John's bread was so hard it could be used as a weapon. Another dispute involved 2 maids fighting over who had to clean the jester's hat after he fell in the moat while juggling. Lady Mavis handled it all with grace and a steady hand. And when illness spread, she didn't flinch. She knew which herbs healed and which ones accidentally got rid of guests who overstayed their welcome. She ran the castle like a fortress, a family, and a business, often all at once. Behind every battle-hardened lord stood a woman with ink-stained fingers, rolled-up sleeves, and zero tolerance for nonsense. If you thought living in a medieval castle was tough, try getting sick in one. The only thing scarier than a sword wound was the cure for it. There were doctors, or more precisely, men who called themselves physicians, but often had more in common with butchers, astrologers, or enthusiastic guessers. Their go-to treatment? Bleeding. Got a headache? Bleed. Stubbed your toe? Bleed. Feeling a bit too cheerful today? You're clearly imbalanced. Bleed. One record from Lady Mavis's castle shows that Sir Thelonious, after laughing too hard at a feast, was told he had excess of joy, and promptly bled into a bowl for 15 minutes. He never laughed. Again without checking his pulse first, and that was just the start. The medicine cabinet looked like something between a witch's pantry and a cursed spice rack. Powdered human skull, used for migraines. Crushed rose petals mixed with emerald dust. Also for headaches, if you were rich. Couldn't afford emeralds? Don't worry, chicken bottom therapy was available. Yes, really. For fevers, they'd shave. A chicken's behind, strap it to your head, and wait for the chicken to look sick. Supposedly, the illness transferred to the bird. Unsurprisingly, the chicken rarely survived. Neither did the fever. Herbs were everywhere. Lavender, wormwood, sage, and mint grew in the castle gardens under Lady Mavis's care. She knew which plants soothed pain and which ones accidentally sent annoying suitors into a peaceful, eternal sleep. Her notes were meticulous. One journal entry read, "Red berries for healing, purple ones for getting rid of guests who talk too much. Surgery was the stuff of nightmares. No anesthesia, no sterile rooms, just hope and a bottle of strong wine." Castle records show that amputations were often performed in under 30 minutes, because any longer and the patient would either pass out or punch the surgeon. Teeth? You had two options: yank it out or fill it with lead. Yes, lead. Apparently, they thought poisoning was a fair trade-off for a temporary end to toothache. One knight had all his teeth pulled before battle so he wouldn't be distracted by pain. Problem solved, until dinner. And don't get started on the stuff they believed had magical healing powers. Dragon's blood, unicorn horn, and mummy powder were all stored in jars and used like miracle cures. Never mind that most of these were either fakes or just very unlucky fish and lizards. Oddly, sometimes these remedies worked. Not because of the fantasy ingredients, but because the actual herbs mixed with honey and wine had natural antibacterial properties. One castle physician swore his cure-all elixir healed anything from sword wounds to heartbreak. It was just wine, honey, rosemary, and thyme, stirred 3 times under a full moon. The stirring part was nonsense, but the honey? That probably helped. Still, no matter how questionable the medicine, everyone had to see the castle healer eventually. Whether you were a knight with an arrow in your thigh or a scullery maid with a burn from the fire pit, you lined up for help and prayed you got the wine treatment, not the chicken. As the sun dipped below the stone towers, the castle changed. Gone were the laughs of jesters and clang of swords. In their place came whispers, shadows, and a cold that crept beneath even the heaviest cloaks. Night in a medieval castle wasn't quiet. It was haunted. Candles were rare. Each one cost about a day's wages. Even Lady Mavis kept her nightly lighting limited, muttering about burning the budget while sipping warm wine. Most folks just went to bed early because staying awake meant stumbling around in pitch black, bumping into chairs, walls, or things you hoped were chairs or walls. Guards like Obasi, brave in daylight, weren't so fearless at night. His torch often made shadows worse, dancing on the stone like flickering ghosts. One entry in his log read, "Mistook Lord Ezra's new suit of armor for a demon, screamed, dented it." Lord Ezra not amused. Ghosts weren't jokes. They were real. Everyone had a story. Some castles even had official ghost sighting logs. One required that guards record the ghost's outfit, because apparently fashion criticism didn't stop at death. One guard noted, "Spectre in North Tower seen wearing outdated tunic. Suggested wardrobe change. Ghost vanished insulted. Even tapestries weren't safe." Obasi once insisted that the East Wing's wall hangings watched him all night. He asked for hazard pay. Lady Mavis granted it, along with a note, "Avoid judging tapestries." Children weren't spared. Young Zuri heard whispers from the stairwell at night. She told her brother Io it was the ghost of a cook who died over bad stew. The real culprit? Probably the wind, or possibly the jester Kwaku, who liked creeping around in flower to prank people. Every noble house had its favorite tale. In Lady Mavis's castle, it was the culinary ghost, said to brew cursed stew in the kitchen at midnight. Smelled like boiled socks. The truth? Hungry night guards ruining meals and blaming ghosts. Still, the legend stuck. Another castle swore their library was haunted by a ghost that rearranged books. Librarians swore it was supernatural. In reality, rats with a taste for parchment, especially cookbooks. According to the librarian, they chewed the cheese recipe section first, noted preference, and then came the beasts. Castle bestiaries were packed with things that went bump in the night. Night crawlers, probably bats, wall demons, mice, and shadow lurkers, definitely cats. You never knew what would dart out of the rushes or skitter along the rafters. Even the toughest knight sometimes swung his sword at his own shadow. One night, Sir Thelonious saw what he swore was a demon lurking in the great hall. He charged. Everyone applauded, until they realized he'd just attacked his own reflection in a polished shield. The jester wrote a ballad about it. The song was still sung a decade later. Nights were dangerous, not just for the eerie tales, but because dungeons lurked below, and the things down there. Those weren't ghosts. They were real, cold, hungry, and very much awake. If the castle was a palace of organized chaos by day and haunted shadows by night, the dungeons were something else entirely. Not just uncomfortable, they were designed to make you wish you'd behaved, paid your debts, or at least kept your mouth shut. Forget the Hollywood image of iron bars, dripping walls, and endless screams. Most castle dungeons were tiny, cold, windowless stone pits, roughly the size of a bathroom stall, no plumbing, no light, and definitely no privacy. It stayed around 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, which was great for storing food. Unfortunate, if you were the food. If you ended up in one, you didn't just sit and stew. You had to pay rent. Yes, prisoners had to fund their own stay. Meals weren't provided unless you or your family could afford to bribe the jailer. One nobleman wrote a furious complaint. Charge 7 silver for rat removal. The rats remain. I demand reimbursement, the jailer replied. They are now your roommates. No refunds. Another prisoner tried to turn his suffering into a business. He started giving dungeon tours to curious nobles. When guards banned it, he sold souvenir rocks, chipped from his cell walls. By the time he was released, he'd made enough to buy a small cottage, though the castle wall had developed a noticeable lean. Some prisoners were noble enough to bring their own staff. One duke demanded his food taster accompany him to jail. The taster resigned after 1 week, citing gruel tasting in a rat-infested pit as a violation of his contract. The most common inmates weren't murderers or traitors, they were debtors. People got locked up for the smallest things: a missed bread payment, a broken egg delivery, or a haircut left unpaid. One poor man did 3 weeks for dodging his barber. The barber visited him weekly in jail, offering another cut with a special inmate discount. Escape? Unlikely. Medieval towns were so small everyone knew everyone. One guy tried to escape disguised as a washerwoman, only for his own mother to recognize him in the street and drag him back by the ear. Another inmate tunneled for 3 days only to burst into the castle pantry. Guards found him elbow-deep in honey, mid-snack. His punishment? Double time in the dark and a mop. Even the jailers weren't thrilled to be there. One wrote in his log, "Jeffrey wants a softer pillow. William says the draft is judgmental. The merchant in cell 3 keeps trying to sell real estate to the others. Request reassignment." The bottom-tier cells were reserved for the worst offenders, or the poorest. No light, no air, no view. One noble who complained about the dungeons. Poor Vista was moved to the lower cell, then wrote 3 sad poems about his lost horizon. The guard called it successful behavioral correction. Yet, somehow, even the dungeon was part of the castle's grand machine. It taught people a lesson. Maybe not always the right one, but a memorable one. And so, each morning, as the rooster cried, the drawbridge creaked, and the ghosts retreated into the shadows, the castle stirred to life once more. From the lady's ledger to the blacksmith's anvil, from the kitchen rushes to the dungeon gloom, one thing was certain: surviving. A day, let alone a night in a medieval castle, wasn't just a chore, it was a miracle.